Finding relational and emotional well-being on your cancer journey is the topic today. And I've laid out several objectives that we're going to discuss. First is just a general definition of what well-being is. And then I'm going to dive into the deeper discussion that leads us into talking about well-being, and that is existential concerns. Then we'll go through what it is to engage in emotional well-being and how that relates to all your relationships. And then we'll have a discussion. Dr. Martin Seligman is the founder of positive psychology, and he identified well-being is that it can't just exist in your own head. It's a combination of feeling good as well as actually having meaning and purpose in life, good relationships, and accomplishments along the way. And so today we're going to talk about how to bring meaning into our lives on your cancer journey and how to nourish and embrace our relationships with those that are in our lives. I've had many of my patients describe their cancer journey as going up a mountain, sometimes alone, sometimes with other people, but always sort of in front of them is a journey. And what I like to also share is that even though it feels like you're alone often, you are not alone. Many of the feelings, emotions, fears, physical pain, physical experiences on your cancer journey are experienced by lots of other people going through the same thing. So just to give you an idea of how many people go through different types of difficulties adjusting to cancer, 50% of those who responded to the 2020 Cancer General Registry for the United States, 50% experienced and reported experiencing anxiety, 40% reported experiencing depression, 70% fear of cancer recurrence. And for my work, that is one that is prevalent in my area. I have a lot of folks who, get to ring the bell, they're so-called cancer-free, but then they're on a maintenance or a come in every 3 months for scans. And every time the scan comes up, they have that, I like to call it a metronome. The anxiety is like this, normal, and then the closer you get to the next scan, the metronome goes off the roof. Fear of recurrence is something that a lot of people struggle with. Quality of life, reported by 50% of folks. So it can be a matter of if you have neuropathy. Many people get neuropathy, you have chemo brain, chemo fog, lots of different things that can impact quality of life, even compromised immune systems, as we saw during COVID-19. Our cancer population was directly impacted because of the immune compromised systems that could be a threat for COVID if you get caught COVID. The other thing is that 50% of caregivers experience anxiety. So if you have a loved one who's your caregiver, you can almost 1 out of 2 are going to also experience anxiety. And our program at the Wake Forest Medical Center, we did a study 10 years ago, probably, that looked at caregiver anxiety in stem cell transplant population. And the caregivers actually exhibited more anxiety, had more anxiety than those who were going through transplant, because the weight of the caregiving can be so impactful. And that's what we're going to talk about today with regard to relationships, particularly those who are caregivers to you and others. So on the one hand, you're all in it together because you all are experiencing similar things different times during your journey, but in a way, we are all alone. And that's the existentialism that comes into play. Dr. Irvin Yalom is a professor at UCLA. He is 92 years old, and he was one of the first psychiatrists to work with a cancer population in the 1970s and 1980s and developed support groups to help people, particularly those with metastatic disease, to deal with the existential concerns that one faces in life, but also particularly when one receives a life-threatening diagnosis such as cancer. And he identified 4 existential concerns: freedom, isolation, meaninglessness, and death anxiety. And I'm going to go over these briefly because it helps bring us to what happens when you are interacting with people you love after you've received a cancer diagnosis and are going through treatment. The first is freedom. This is this beautiful, beautiful donkey here. And there's an old myth about a donkey who is standing in front of 2 bales of hay, the exact same size, the exact same amount of hay, but that poor donkey can't make a decision to save his life. And that decision-making can be a burden to us, particularly if you're facing different types of decisions in cancer treatment. Making decisions, taking responsibility for what your life is and what you want your life to be can be very, very difficult, even without a diagnosis. But it becomes even more so when you don't know if you want to go for another round of treatment, or you are done with treatment, or you want to go to a different doctor. Let's say you want a second or third opinion and you feel guilty that the doctor that got you this far can't get you there anymore. And you have to make that decision to go someplace else. So freedom and this responsibility and decision-making is integral to human existence, but particularly when you're on your journey for cancer. Viktor Frankl is one of the fathers of existential therapy and counseling. He was a survivor of the Holocaust. He lost his entire family in concentration camps, and he survived and wrote a book about it and developed his own type of therapy, which is called Logotherapy. And the idea is that even through suffering, we can find meaning and purpose in life. And he talks here and he says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. My father was an athletic director and a coach. He's now retired. And the thing that he said to all of his athletes was, you can choose your attitude and you can choose effort in any situation, and that will get you through it. And when I work with my cancer patients, this is something we talk about a lot. What is it that you're going to commit to? What is the decision you need to make? How are you going to choose that decision? And then what's your attitude around the decision? Viktor Frankl wrote a whole book called Man's Search for Meaning that talked about how people were survivors of the concentration camps. And part of it was being able to make choices and to accept that sometimes life brings us suffering, but through suffering, we can find meaning and purpose in life. The second of Dr. Yalom's existential concerns is isolation. And this is where we get into relationships. In general, existentially, we're alone. We come into the world alone and we leave the world alone. But while we're here, we have interpersonal relationships with our friends, with our partners, with our spouses, our parents, our family, coworkers. Big picture. Sometimes, however, we can feel deeply isolated from those people. And cancer in general and cancer in particular can be isolating, particularly if somebody has never met someone who's had cancer, which is rare, but there are people who have not ever had cancer in their life. And they don't know how to talk to you. They feel awkward. They don't know what to respond to when you talk about your treatment. And they might pull away, but you might feel yourself pulling away because you don't want to talk to somebody who can't just listen and support you. And that leads to a whole bunch of other emotions thereafter, which we'll talk about. Intrapersonally, you might actually also just distance yourself from everyone. You might not want to be around people who love you, but you just simply can't handle them going about their day as if nothing happened because something really big has happened to you. And in happening to you, you sort of isolate and withdraw. Dr. Yalom describes existential isolation as the unbridgeable gap between self and others, a gap that exists even in the presence of deeply gratifying interpersonal relationships. One is isolated not only from other beings, but to the extent that one constitutes one's world from the world as well. So I don't know if any of you have had these sense of feeling of isolation, withdrawal. We experienced it also during COVID when the world was shut down, when we were all shut down from our loved ones, from our homes, people who weren't in our homes. We became isolated within our homes. He talks about relationships, and I think this is a really important one when it comes to people in our lives if you're going through cancer. He describes a relationship at its best involves individuals who relate to one another in a need-free fashion. So think about that, a need-free fashion. And that's what happens when your roles change, particularly with spouses or children. You suddenly become someone who needs something when you didn't need it before. You need caregiving. You need someone to take you to doctor's appointments. You need someone perhaps to help you bathe, perhaps to help you dress, help you take your medicines, drive you to the store because you can't drive currently. There's so many things that happen in the relationship after your diagnosis that creates a need-based relationship, and that upsets the apple cart, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, whether it's neighbors. One of the other existential concerns Dr. Yalom brings up is meaninglessness. And one of the things that happens a lot when people have a cancer diagnosis is you were either working outside the home or you were working within the home as the major provider of food and meals and organization, or you were volunteering somewhere, or you were taking care of grandkids. And suddenly that meaning and purpose in life, which you found from that kind of work, is taken away. Whether you take off and you're on disability for 6 months, or you may retire, you're close to retirement, but you lose a sense and purpose sometimes when you're going through cancer treatment. I think said she quit her job, retired early when she had her cancer diagnosis. And so meaninglessness in general, we are creatures of meaning. We are different than my 3 dogs, or somebody had a cat earlier. We as humans need meaning in life to find purpose in why we're here. And if that's taken from you, it can lead to depression, anxiety, sadness, hopelessness. And so in working with trying to identify or re-identify meaning, we look to values, we look to spirituality. It can be religious or not. We look at legacy making. What are you going to leave for future generations, or maybe just your grandchildren or your children? What can you do vocationally that you didn't do before, but would still bring purpose and meaning in life? Could you volunteer at a school, or could you volunteer? I have a lot of cancer patients who, once they're done with treatment, will volunteer at the hospital, not in the cancer center, but as transport or working as info volunteers. They felt so comfortable knowing what the hospital was that they decided to volunteer. And then, because we're talking about relationships are also a part of, as the gentleman, I think, said, he lost a friendship after he got cancer. There's a sense of meaninglessness there. What was the 55 years that we were together? What happened to all of those years that the last 2 have been so horrible that he can't talk to me? So this can lead to trying to identify what is of value to us now. And Simone de Beauvoir, who was a French existentialist writer and philosopher, suggested that one's life has value so long as one attributes value to the life of others. So maybe it's not the friends you had since you were in grade school, or maybe it's not the daughter who, was with you and now isn't because of some political craziness in the world. I'll just leave it at that. But there are other people who are other people that you value and value you, and seek to spend time with those people. It sounds like she's a very small community that she's been able to connect with and feel safe sharing her journey, but then also knowing she doesn't always have to talk about cancer. For others, it might be your church or your synagogue or your temple. It all depends on where you find connection to things greater than you, but also things that are part of you, which is friendship and family and colleagues. And then we have death anxiety. And I, as a counselor working in cancer care, when I was an intern, this is my 3rd career. This is not my first. I've been around the block a bit, but I started working with cancer patients on the inpatient unit. And I started to have mild panic attacks walking into rooms. And I realized I had major death anxiety. I wanted to do this work, but I wasn't ready to do the work until I got therapy to work through my own anxiety. And so we all have it. We're born with it. When you're diagnosed with cancer, it can sometimes become the only thing you see. And so I work a lot with my patients on mortality, immortality, legacy, fears of dying. And these are the 4 that Dr. Yalom has identified: pain and suffering. If you have fear of death and dying, some people might be, I'm afraid of pain and I'm afraid of suffering. Particularly if your cancer journey has been one of pain or suffering, this can become a really, really powerful fear for some of my patients in particular. And we work through that and we talk about it, and we talk about palliative care. We talk about all the kinds of ways that pain and suffering don't have to be the thing that you experience. Fear of the unknown. right? Am I going to go to heaven if you believe in heaven, or am I going to go to hell? Am I going to go to nirvana? What happens to me spiritually in an afterworld if you believe in an afterworld? Some people don't. And then there's a fear of nothingness. What was my purpose in life? If when I'm gone, it just disappears. I disappear. I'm no longer there. I'm no longer here. And then the one that is most often shared with me is separation from family. And that's what leads to sadness and anxiety as people are going through the cancer treatment and cancer journeys. I want to see my grandkids grow up. I want to see my marriage go to 50 years. We live as a future-oriented society. And so when you get a life-threatening illness, the future seems to be put on hold, or it's further away than you imagined. So what Dr. Yalom suggests, and is what I work with my patients to do, is to live your life every day as fully as possible. So the more unlived your life, the greater your death anxiety. The more you fail to experience your life fully, the more you will fear death. And this is after he wrote a whole book on his own fear of dying. It's a fantastic book. It's called Staring into the Sun. Highly recommend it. Irvin Yalom. It's a paperback. A psychiatrist who had worked in psychiatry for decades decided he's going to work with cancer patients, metastatic breast cancer. And he couldn't go into the room, just kind of like me. I couldn't walk into the inpatient rooms because he was so fearful of dying. And through his own personal therapy, I've gone to therapy myself for it, he realized that this is the essence of what the fear really comes from. And so if you can try to live your life every day as if you're going to live for eternity, and that day is the best day it's ever going to be, that helps reduce it because you're getting as much out of life as possible. It's that concept of carpe diem, seize the day. Seize the day. So that was some heavy stuff, right? We're talking about existential issues. Now we're going to go into more of the hands-on, what I like to say is techniques and how to do some of the things that are going to help you improve your relationships and help you live more emotionally centered and grounded. So emotional well-being is described as possessing the ability to feel and express human emotions, cope with stress, be aware of personal feelings and others' feelings, think positively of self and others, and be flexible and adaptable. And if you think about that definition, that encompasses everything in a relationship. So I'm going to go back to you because your story was so poignant to me. The flexible and adaptable that's described here, that's a friend, your friend wasn't flexible and adaptable to be able to meet you where you were in life. So he could work on, say, his emotional well-being by becoming more and more adaptable to things that happen to himself and to other people. You talked about positive spin on your cancer journey by writing that story, right? So if you can think positively, there's a whole vast amount of research and data to show that a positive reframe is actually beneficial. Statistically speaking, living from a positive framework helps you with your mood, helps with your health, helps with your mental health, and that's part of your emotional well-being. Being able to go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, Dr. Rainwater, I was just going to say and what it says there about, think positively of self and others. And, I think that's really impactful when some people wrong us, let's say, because we have cancer or whatever, or because of our political beliefs, then having the emotional well-being to overlook and to even accept their flaws, if you will, and that grace and that forgiveness, I think is really important for our own well-being.
Absolutely, Dusty. Thank you for bringing that up, because when you were sharing about differing beliefs between your child and you and how it's torn you apart, and that positive thinking of self and others positively is just that, forgiving, being gracious for those who are in our lives, and forgiveness. And I don't know if anybody's heard this. I'm sure you have. It's not something I made up, but forgiveness is not really about the other person. It's about ourselves. And there's a really wonderful book by Thich Nhat Hanh called Anger. And he is a Vietnamese monk. He's died about 2 years ago, has written voraciously from a Buddhist philosophical viewpoint of how to live life. And he talks about anger as it's a baby in our arms, and that we want to rock and caress our anger, because anger is an important emotion. It always has been since we became humans and not of the great ape family. But how do you engage with people who have harmed you, who have hurt you, who have ignored you, who have abandoned you? And it's that forgiveness in that moment is really about letting yourself off, removing that heavy weight that you carry with you. And that's part of also being able to cope with stress and being aware of other people's feelings and other people and your own feelings. So the next slide, I think. Get the next slide. Aha. So how do you go about increasing emotional well-being? Let's say you're on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high emotional IQ. Let's say you're a 6. It's pretty good. And you want to get to an 8. Well, this is from the National Institute of Health. They've developed this idea of several things can help you. One is to build resilience. What is resilience? Resilience is adaptability and flexibility. I use in my work with folks who are grieving, but also with my cancer patients, the idea of the American buffalo. It's the only mammal on the North American continent that knows instinctively that to get through a storm, it has to go right through it. It can't stop. It can't avoid it. It can't run from it. It has to go straight through it. So you can picture those iconic photographs of all the buffalo in a line winding down through the plains and the mountains, and they all have the crusted snow on them. They know that's the way to get through a storm. Domesticated cattle on the same plains run from the storm. They become depleted, their energy, their resources, and they often succumb to the storm. And grief and cancer can be a storm, right? And building resilience is every time you run into a challenge, how do you rebound? How do you come back to it? How do you get back up and pick yourself up and go again? That's one of the most important things about emotional well-being is your resilience factor. Another is reduce stress. It's not the easiest, but how do you reduce stress? You can exercise. You can eat healthy foods. You can create boundaries, healthy boundaries. People who are toxic or people who are negative in your space, you can create a boundary that person doesn't cross the boundary. If you're working while you're going through treatment, you can talk to your boss or your employment and suggest, could I do 3 days instead of 5 days? Anything that you can do to reduce some of the stress is greatly helpful. And one of those is asking for help. You can reduce stress by asking others to help you. One of the things that I have a lot of people say is, well, I don't know, people want to help me and I don't know what to have them help me with. And I suggest you keep a list and you write it down or you type it, you print it, and you have 50 copies. And anytime anyone says, I'd like to do something for you, you hand them the list. And you also say, this is going to be a half an hour. This is going to be an hour task. This is going to be $10, whatever that is, so that they can make a decision on their own. Because believe it or not, people love to help other people. And the easiest you can make it for yourself, it's even easier for them. It helps you reduce the stress. Quality sleep is important. And I know a lot of you probably struggle with sleep or have struggled with sleep because of the different types of medications you've been on or your treatments have just changed your sleep habits. But trying to get quality sleep is very, very important in overall emotional well-being. We're talking about relationships, strengthening social connections. That's a whole theme today. And we continue to talk as we go through the rest of our slideshow, how to strengthen social connections. Coping with loss. I'm a grief counselor, and grief is not just about the loss of someone through death. Grief is a loss of hair, of body parts, of daily living activities you used to do with no problems at all, of the ability to go to work. There are so many kinds of loss that we experience in life. And our society doesn't do a very good job of helping people cope with loss. And that is one of the ways that your well-being can be really, truly dampened down if you don't admit and adjust to loss. And then the last one is practicing mindfulness, which is one of my favorites because I do a lot of mindfulness practice with my clients. Mindfulness is a pure definition of becoming aware of the present moment. And it's a simple concept, but it really works. When I talk about anxiety and depression with clients or in groups, we often like to use anxiety as the person who's worried about the future. Depression is the person who's worried about the past. Mindfulness is you're right here and right now, the existential moment of all of us sharing this time together right here. We're not thinking about dinner. We're not thinking about the cat. We're not thinking about the dog that needs to go out. We're not thinking about the phone calls we have to make or going to a doctor's appointment. It's trying to remain in the present. And the present can be done in many different ways mindfully. You can take a mindful walk. I know, Vicki, you said you wanted to do 1 mile a day. That's a great way to get exercise. When you're walking, you could also have a mindfulness walk. And if you don't walk a mile, you can walk to your post box or you can walk to the street and pay attention to your 5 senses. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? What do you touch? And if there's cherries or there's peaches in your tree, what could you be eating? What could you taste? Or if you're at the beach, you might taste sea salt. Paying attention to 5 senses grounds you every time. Why? Because you can't think of anything else. Your senses are overwhelmed with what you're paying attention to. Reflection. So here's a time for us to ask. I'll raise questions and you can share if you like. The first question, where do I find myself right now? And the second question, what have I been through? Where do I find myself right now? And what have I been through? Creative arts is a really wonderful way to express yourself, even things that you normally can't say out loud. You can express your creative arts. And there's a project that I do with folks that you cut out 9 squares and you imagine it's a quilt. And you, on each square, 1 square is going to say cancer, but then the 8 other squares, you write what other things identify who you are, whether it's mother, son, musician, baker, gardener, and then you paste them all together or glue them all together. And then you make a frame out of cardboard. And on the frame, what is it that holds your life together? It might be humor. It might be family. It might be God. It might be whatever that is. And then I encourage people to put it someplace very prominent on your desk, near your kitchen, if you cook a lot. And you realize very quickly, cancer is just 1 tiny square of my 9 square life. So I like that you're really thinking about differently how cancer does not define you. Anybody else want to share? I'm going to move on to finding meaning and connection through personal relationships. So what is relational well-being and how do we look at relational well-being? We have relationships with people who may be our spouses or our partners, who may be family members, friends, lifelong, or people you meet at a book club. Community. What type of community are you involved in? Whether that be a spiritual, religious one, or you might be involved with a local theater troupe. I have folks who are writers, who are members of a writing group. What community do you belong to? Coworkers. If some of you had to quit work after you started your treatment, what's your relationship with your coworkers today? Check in on you, check in on them. We have neighbors, right? I was talking about the small little neighborhood community that she has and that she's able to reach out to. Neighbors are important. Neighbors got us through a lot during COVID, right? You heard about the COVID bubbles. So once everybody felt safe to be outside and sit across from each other 6 feet or more, people in neighborhoods would get together and talk because they needed that social connection. I like to describe, and I'm going to pose this as a question, that we have friends and family with capital F's and friends and families with small f's. Who'd like to talk about which is which? How would you define capital F, friends and family, versus small f, friends and family? Anybody?
I'll say that my Facebook friends, I love them, but if they're not part of my daily life, like a friend and a neighbor, we walk every day. That's a friend with a capital F. And some of my Facebook friends, sometimes I have to look up the relationship because I'm like, have we even met before? So, I mean, some of them I'm very close with, but some of them are way on the fringes. And I say the fringes, they're just not part of my everyday life. So they're not as, and the same with family. My family members, my children, when I say children, I mean my son-in-law, my daughter-in-law, they're my children as well, and my grandchildren. They're that immediate circle. And so they're, F, uppercase F. And then other family members, some cousins I haven't seen in a long time, and they wouldn't recognize them maybe if we crossed each other on the street because they live miles away. Those are not as important in my daily life.
Excellent. Thanks, Dusty. Yes, very good description. So those in that constellation, it's sort of the ripple effect. Who is closest to me? And as you move out in the outer rings who are further away, it's not that I don't like them or love them, but they're not necessarily part of my daily existence. So I think probably why I'm here is because a lot of you thought you had capital F friends and family. And after a cancer diagnosis, they became small f, friends and family. And what that means is those people like your friend who just simply can't handle a cancer diagnosis for whatever reason, they are no longer the person you can rely upon for anything. Or they may, send you a card once a month, but they're not going to come visit. They're not going to pick up the phone. They're not going to text. They're still out there, but they're no longer the way they were before your cancer diagnosis. The ones with the capital F, they can be people that you weren't really even close to before your cancer diagnosis, but suddenly they're part of your meal train. They are dropping off groceries. They are calling you and checking in just to say, hi, don't want to bother you, just want to say, I was thinking about you today. They're the people that rise to the occasion. And oftentimes it's because they've gone through something similar with another loved one in their life, and they've toughened their skin and they're able to do it. Other times it's just that their heart is so big that that's their calling. But I work a lot with folks who have all of you have been very sharing of your relationships, and I really appreciate that. That's how reframing the situation with relationships can help you. So if you feel down or you feel like, wow, why hasn't so-and-so called me, or why hasn't so-and-so stopped by? You can think of it and reframe it. Oh, well, that person is a small f. And then return to who are the ones who are always there for you, right?
If you haven't heard from somebody in a while, could you reach out to them?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things that is sometimes helpful, if you feel comfortable with it, is also recognizing who can you talk to about non-cancer related things, right? So let's say you love the New York Yankees. Go Yankees, right? You can root for the Yankees and you can talk about baseball, but you're not going to talk about your last scan, or you're not going to talk about a scan coming up, or you're not going to talk about diarrhea. You're just going to talk about Yankees, right? So identify, self-reflect, and I have a slide, I think, in journaling in here, but journaling is a really good way to let your emotions out, explore what your thoughts are, your feelings. You could even journal, who are my friends that I can talk to about my diarrhea? Right? There are going to be some people who say, oh my gosh, I take this supplement and they'll go on for 15 minutes about how they cure their diarrhea. Other people will run from you. No way, no how. I don't want to hear that. And they won't call you for 6 weeks because, oh my gosh, she's going to talk about diarrhea again. Right? So really be intentional. The word mindful again, mindful about what you share and with whom. Really important to think about. So absolutely pick up the phone and call that person. If she's not one to talk about diarrhea, probably don't want to talk about, gas either, right? But figure out what it is that you want to talk to your friends about and who can hear and who can't.
There's also the loss of friends. I've made through this and other communities a number of friends, some very close ones, some that I go on walks with and meet up with, and some I just talk to. I remember one in a support group that I first joined early on that had survived with lung cancer for over 20 years. And she'd had recurrences, but was always okay until she wasn't. And she's gone. And that really, the loss of close friends and close family, for whatever reason, but especially if it's cancer related, I think affects us all very deeply if they were there for us and we were there for them. And so it's great comfort and sometimes joy and laughter, depending on the group that we're in, to go to these groups, but to lose some of them, which is inevitable, and they know it and we know it, but it still hurts so much. And dealing with it is very tough. And I get reminded of them when something strikes my memory that I associated with them. And then I think about them again. And sometimes I actually call their significant others and ask how they're doing, because they were their caregivers. So, but it's hard. Just wanted to throw that out there.
I appreciate that. You're absolutely right. I've been invited to different support groups where they've lost a member to walk them through a grief session, a sort of a memorializing and celebration of that person's life, because it is a loss. And it's also an ambiguous loss, because the rest of society doesn't recognize how important that person was to you. So if you say to another person, oh, I lost my friend so-and-so, she was in my support group, they're not going to see the significance of that. And so you also don't get the type of grief support from other people in the circle as you would if it were your brother or a spouse, right? It's a different type of loss. We can also call it disenfranchised loss. Nobody knows what to do with it. Anybody else want to talk on that topic? It also brings up your own mortality, right? You walk alongside that person, you share your fears. Some of you shared fears here today, and suddenly, oh no, that person's gone. Am I next? Goes back to death anxiety, right? What's my future look like? If she could go, I could go. We can all go. But definitely when you lose a friend in a support group, that can be very difficult. I'm sorry for your loss. Relational changes. Touched upon this a little bit. So depending on what type of relationship it is, obviously there are different types of relationships, but I primarily talk about spouses or partners, and I talk about adult children, because adult children oftentimes will be participatory in the caregiving roles of a ill parent. And what happens to those roles? If you're partnered, one person, two people went to work every day, brought home dual income, or one person stayed at home and took care of everything, the other person came home. Whatever that is, and however you manifested your partner relationship, when you get a cancer diagnosis and you're going through treatments, those roles are going to change. And a marriage that was solid to begin with is going to get through it. A marriage that was rocky to begin with, or weighted heavily on one side of the role or the other, can have a really difficult time getting through cancer treatment and beyond. And you might never have thought about separation until suddenly somebody has cancer, one or the other. But the guilt of leaving the person will prevent that from happening. I see this a lot, actually, and the person will stay. But then there is this grinding feeling of, why do I keep doing this? So that's where couples counseling comes in. And I'm the only one that does couples counseling in our practice. And talking it out, understanding the changes and shifts in roles can be really, really beneficial if a marriage is struggling. Responsibilities. With role changes come changes in responsibilities. I see this a lot with male cancer patients who have lost strength or fatigued or muscle mass, and they used to do the more quote unquote manly things around the house or in the yard, and suddenly they can't. And the responsibilities, where do they go? How do they shift? Do you change the responsibilities to now the husband is in the kitchen and the wife is out in the yard, or do you hire somebody? Or do you pay the neighborhood kid to come and take care of it? These are all things that if you don't have emotional well-being, if you can't express yourself and you can't connect with other people and understand other people's feelings, it can be really difficult to navigate shifting roles and changing responsibilities. And again, that's where counseling could come in and help you identify and change more gracefully. Physical needs. There are a lot of folks who go through treatment, particularly breast cancer patients, because it's difficult to dress. There's things that if you have a mastectomy, you have to have dressings changed. I know this is a lung cancer group, but all types of cancer have different physical changes and needs. And some of them you don't want your child to do, your adult child. Some of them you don't want your spouse to do, helping you bathe, helping you toilet, helping you, all these kinds of physical things that change because of treatment or cancer can impact your relationship. I always suggest the best is to ask, can I help you? If you're the caregiver, how can I best help you? And as the person who needs help, be very direct in what you need, because then there's no misunderstandings. There's a lot of telepathy that goes on between partners and even adult children and parents, and being vocal and sharing what you need is a much better way to reduce potential friction. And that goes with emotional needs. Sometimes it's really helpful to take time out. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Some people aren't expressive emotionally. And if you don't have that ability, or you don't know how to express your emotions, the other partner might feel cut out, left out. So making sure that you recognize that your partner wants to see your emotions too. And a lot of people don't want to talk about, what are you afraid of? What is your worst fear? But that can draw you closer together, which leads to intimacy between partners, intimacy between spouses. Isn't just sex. Large percentage of people who go through cancer treatment have difficulties with sexual relations afterwards. It's like 79% or something. It's painful. There are difficulties due to treatments, due to drugs, due to drug interactions. But that doesn't mean that you have to lose that closeness that you have with your partner. Holding hands, cuddling up and watching a movie, going for a walk, kissing each other each morning, afternoon, and night. There are things that you can do to continue to keep that intimate bond that brought you together to begin with, which also feeds into your emotional wellness. Finances can change. If you were a dual house income and suddenly one of you is not working, things are going to drastically change, right? You may have to turn to a savings account or a 401k, or you might have to borrow money from a brother or a father. Things can be very complicated because cancer is very, very expensive. And there's something called financial toxicity, not to talk about here, but that impacts a family and it impacts a couple in particular. And finally, future planning. Future planning is something that is also oftentimes put on hold. Well, I have cancer, so now I'm not going to go on the family vacation. And it gets put off, and it gets put off, and it gets put off. And that stifles one's ability to be hopeful. So I encourage people to make future plans. Don't spend a lot of money doing it, but plan for the future, because just like Dr. Yalom said, right? You want to live every day as if you would get up the next day and live it again because it was so wonderful. And if you're planning for the future, you're positive oriented, and it helps you get through the darkest of days. So these are relationship tips. Many we've already talked about: communication, understanding. What were the coping strategies that helped you get through life prior to your cancer diagnosis? Go back to those, because those are always there for you. Time outs. If you and your partner are, take a time out. You might need a break. They might need a break. Again, remain intimate. Develop or continue hobbies and activities that you like to do together. If you like to go bike riding, maybe you're not up to bike riding, but going for a walk. Keep friends and family, again, capital F, small f, support groups, which you all are doing here. Keeping each other accountable for those roles and those relationships that you change, or responsibilities. Make sure that if I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. Counseling, I've already talked about. And then my last slide is benefits. And I'm sure all of you know the benefits of relational well-being: increased feelings of connectedness, unconditional support, improvement on social skills, partner intimacy. There's that word resilience again, improved mood, boosts your immune system, and it's a validation of your feelings.